Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Iain MacGregor, the author of The Hiroshima Men, The Quest to Build the Atomic Bomb and the Fateful Decision to Use It. This is his third book, and he is a nonfiction editor, public speaker, and also writer of pieces that have appeared in The Guardian and The Washington Post. Iain, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me over.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. It is so easy to forget that we are potentially one short war, one misunderstood order, or even one malfunction away from either dying or rendering the earth uninhabitable. Nuclear weapons of today are more than 1,000 times stronger than the bombs that killed 100,000 people in Japan in 1945. Iain's book opens with a message from Kenji Shiga, the former director of the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum, and it's jarring to hear him describe as a child the survivors of the bombing. He saw them with his own eyes. And so, Iain, the first question I have for you is just why was it important for you to not open the book with politics or with strategy or the enormous toll the war took on soldiers, but on the human side of these bombings, the sides of the victims of these enormous bombings, and also the people who were the first people to understand the true power of nuclear power?
Yeah, I mean, it's that's the kind of thing how I approach my books. So you mentioned I've done three books. So the first one was on almost an eyewitness history of the life of the Berlin Wall during the Cold War, and then the second one is about disabusing Soviet propaganda around their greatest victory in World War II, which is Stalingrad. And then there's this one with Hiroshima. And with all three, what I've tried to do is it's always putting the human experience first. That's to me is the most important. How people then interpret that when they're reading the book or they're coming to listen to my talks in terms of, well, because I've been asked the question, especially with this book, whose side are you on? Why have you put this testimony in? Why haven't we got this testimony? Uh, so I thought I've got to really, it doesn't matter what I mean is it doesn't matter whether the atomic bomb was dropped on Japan or Germany or anywhere else. It's a human experience. I'm seeing beyond national boundaries. So I wanted to hit the reader in the solar plexus straight away and say, well, this is one person's experience who survived having history's first atomic bomb dropped on them.
And how important was it for you to explain and illustrate the enormous power and something that, unless you were in those two cities in 1945, you haven't experienced yourself?
Well, that becomes a mixture of archive research, uh, online and in the archives themselves, both in America and in Japan. Then it becomes a case of reading copious amounts of memoirs of people like, for instance, I'm sure we're going to be talking about it, but the Manhattan Project, looking at some of the key people that were working there, uh, and basing your research on that because it's a mixture of the technical with the personal, and then you try because I want to make this a book that anyone can pick up, look at, and read, and not be confounded by science. Uh, you mentioned it already. I mean, there's no getting away from the fact you're going to be horrified by the results, but it's to give a clear, concise kind of journey for the reader to show you, well, this is the story arc. This is why it was a logical decision by the American administration of Truman to drop the atomic bombs at the end of the war to finish it.
Before we go on, I do want to mention that AxelbankHistory.com, which was just launched, was designed by Nikki Rideout of Ellie Claire Designs. Check her work out. It has our most recent episodes on it. It has featured episodes and also a link to our Patreon page. We are taping this episode, Iain, just a few days shy of the 80th anniversary of the bombings, August 6th and 9th of 1945. And Michiko Kodama is someone who remembers that moment. You talked to her. She was one of the Habikusha, uh, people affected by the bombing, is what the Japanese word means. So, first of all, what was it like to sit across from someone who was telling you about being literally nuclear bombed?
She was my very first interview as I was on a 2 week research trip to Japan 2 years ago. So, and as you'd be aware, you have to plan these meticulously. It takes months because you're setting up. I interviewed over a dozen people across Japan in the end because it's not just about the atomic attacks, it's about the war in general. I have to organize the translators because I don't speak or read Japanese. So I've got to get it 100% accurate. So I'm with my interpreters as well. So we're sitting down in her office. She's the Assistant Secretary General of what is now, I suppose, the still the biggest survivors, atomic survivors group, Nihon Nidanko. They just won the Nobel Peace Prize last year for the work they do. Their numbers are shrinking. So we're sitting in her office, and it was only supposed to be an hour's talk that morning on a Monday. I arrived on the Sunday, went straight into the first meeting the next day. She answered all my questions, and that's kind of what is in the prologue to my book is her experience. I'm telling the reader what it was like in the first few hours of that bomb dropping on Hiroshima through a child's eyes, because I think that's the most powerful because it's innocent and it's true. Uh, and then we're getting up to leave, and she said, "Well, don't you want to know about the rest of what life was like for me after Hiroshima?" And we're like, "Of course." And that took another 2 hours. So we were there till lunchtime. And without giving too many spoiler alerts away, but she she's walking me through what life was like for a typical atomic survivor in terms of the stigmatism that's attached to them because they've survived and they're living in a society that as yet doesn't understand the science and the biology of radiation poisoning. And so it's almost like you're to her anyway. It was people are looking at her like she's emitting evil spirits. So you're looking at someone who went on this odyssey for the rest of their, for the next 30 years anyway, of having to change jobs when people found out she was Hibashka. She was, proposed marriage twice, but as soon as the guy's families find out she's Hibashka,
That
she never hears
shocked
from them
me.
again.
That
Yeah,
shocked
it
me.
shocked
Yeah.
me when she was telling me all this. And then, of course, and then you get to the just heartbreaking story of, you know, she does get married to a guy who's also an atomic survivor. So there's a connection there. They have a child late in life, one daughter, and the daughter did grow up healthy and strong, but by the time their daughter's in her 30s, she has a diagnosis of cervical cancer and she's dead in 6 months. And you could have cut the room, the atmosphere in the room with a pin drop. It was just very, very emotional. And then she ends this kind of story of misery by saying, my parents died of cancer, my husband's died of cancer, both my younger brothers died of cancer, and my daughter's died of cancer, and I'm the only one left. And by that time, my translator's in tears. And my translator was actually Japanese American from LA. She'd just come in to help me for that 2 weeks. And I thought, wow, that's my first morning of my first day in Japan doing the research. Just that absolutely struck me. And again, as I said to you before we started recording, it was the way she told me this story. It was, there was no anger or bitterness or resentment in the way she was telling it. She just wanted to tell it and say, well, this is what my life's been like.
Without giving too much away, because we want people to read the book, just give us a little bit of a primer here on what she said about that morning. I mean, it's the car wreck thing. You don't want to take a
Sure,
too close of a
sure.
look at it, but it's also hard to look away. What did
Yeah.
she tell us?
Well, it's she sees the atomic bomb experience starting her first day at a new school because luckily, and I say luckily, the listeners will understand why I want to finish this story. Her family is very wealthy, ex-samurai, but they've gone into business and they are very wealthy. They've got multiple houses around Hiroshima, but their main house, a big villa, is in where Ground Zero would have been. But because of the B-29 incendiary raids that are crisscrossing the whole of Japan, reducing the country to ruins, there are certain cities that have been left, that have been spared that destruction because obviously the target committee for the Manhattan Project is saving cities from destruction, because once they're chosen to have the bomb dropped on them, they'll need to actually measure the destruction. So Hiroshima hasn't been touched. But anyway, the authorities are demolishing hundreds or if not thousands of houses to create fire breaks because of these incendiary attacks. Her house is one of them. So to cut a long story short, she can't go to the school she would normally go to. The family move a mile, what would be a mile and a half outside of the ground zero explosion. So I start my story. Her father's literally just dropped her off at a new school. She sits down at a desk, looks out the window, and a little boy explodes. And then it's a
And
case of her world's turned upside down. Her father scrambles back. She survives, obviously, as do quite a few of her schoolmates, lots of injuries. So hundreds of pupils and teachers are covered in broken glass and bits of wood stuck in their skin and that kind of thing. That's the kind of injuries they've got. They're not vaporized or anything like that. But tellingly, the school that she'd left, that she attended for a few years, that's in ground zero, the school's completely gone. All the pupils, teachers dead. So that would have been her fate. Her father comes back and then he says to her, we're going to have to get to your grandparents right on the other side of the city. But that means we've got to cross through the center of town. And then so the rest of that day is she's clinging onto her father's back and he's tiptoeing his way through what is dystopian destruction of the worst horror film you could imagine. People with severe burns that will kill them, people with limbs blown off, people with, it gets very gory because that's the nature of an atomic bomb. It's people whose eyeballs have melted. All of these shocking things that an 8-year-old child is witnessing. And that's how I tell the first part of the story, because I just thought I want readers to know this is what it did.
yeah. The next chapter of your book is titled The Good War.
Mm.
It's often described, and you may or may not agree with this, I'm not sure if you do, it's described as a necessary war to
Yeah.
stop fascist powers from killing even more people and depriving even more people of democracy. How does looking people in the eye who were impacted by these decisions, how does that impact the perspective that this
Yeah.
was the good war?
Well, I get that anyway, because Britain was there with the Americans in the Pacific and Southeast Asia. I have relatives that fought in Southeast Asia. Uh, so I have had very elderly people at my talks in the UK come up to me, and either their fathers were fighting in Southeast Asia against the Japanese, or in a couple of cases they were there themselves. So they're really interesting talks. They're not accusations or anything, as in, are you on the Japanese side? And I've been at pains to say to them, and I explain because it's in the book. I say, I'm talking to you about absolutely the democracies had to fight the Japanese in the Pacific. They were in the same, what they did in the Pacific mirrors what the Nazis were doing on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union in the Second World War too, in terms of brutal occupation, subjugation of the local populations, indoctrination, slave labor, executions, you name it, they did it. But what I'm saying about the good war is I don't think you can call it the good war in terms of how both sides went about fighting one another. I mean, most historians will agree there's no weapon off the table in the fight in the Pacific. Everything's used. If both sides could have used poison gas, maybe they would have done, but that wasn't used. And if the Japanese had developed an atomic bomb, absolutely in the blink of an eye, they would have used it too. Uh, but what I say is, because of that, I'm trying to show the reader where would be the logic that people would question nowadays of why President Truman authorized the dropping of the first atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I'm charting that path through the book to show you there is a logical progress to this because of the brutality of the fighting, the suicidal defense of the Pacific fortifications on the islands that the Japanese had set up in the first year of the war. That they had such an expansive empire on the mainland as well, and it's because of that type of fighting that they're in that's what brings about this kind of vicious fighting that devolves into what we need to finish this war. Uh, and finally, what I said to a group of students I spoke to a couple of weeks ago was, because obviously we're Europeans, so they will know about the German. They were senior high school students, so they know about the European war. And I said, well, if you look at the last year of the war in Europe, Germany could have surrendered, but they didn't because the hardliners were in charge. So the Allies, all of us, had to overrun the whole country and destroy it. And that last year of the war, millions of casualties because of that crucial moment when the Germans decided they weren't going to surrender; they were going to go down fighting. So if you look at Japan, it's the same scenario, but this time they are going to go down fighting, and it's going to be, what do we do? So that's where I'm coming from about the good war. In some senses, it's a good war because you're fighting for democracy, but it's what it costs you in terms of defeating that kind of enemy. That's where I'm coming from in my book.
Yeah. Um, let's go back to the beginning here. Who was the first to have the idea that maybe something so powerful could be built that it would literally depend on the ability to split atoms themselves in half? Who had the idea that it would be more than just an explosion you could create, that you could actually separate matter and that would create the explosion?
Scientists in Europe had been working on it for years after the Great War, in terms of splitting the atom, the neutron atom,
And
the
that meaning World
discovery.
War One, right? Yeah.
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 Straight
Yeah.
after
Yeah.
that, and then there's been a steady progression, and that's where you've got like I suppose like it is today or any time outside of war, where the communities of science, especially physics, are sharing their information in terms of papers that they're writing, lectures that they're giving. So there was it wasn't a hugely well kept secret that the discovery of enriched how you enrich uranium to get 235, but where it starts to become a race is by 1938. Two German physicists, Otto Hahn and Frisch Strassmann, they're the ones that developed the finding that U238 and U235, that's the key one. U235, if you enrich it, uh, could be potentially explosive, as in it's the release of energy. So if you hit an atom of U235, it splits like water, it just fragments. And it's the release of energy from that then will continue to hit atom after atom after atom until you get what's called fission. And they realized by, again, to jump through, because I could give you a 2 hour lecture on this, to jump through is where you get the knowledge by the start of the war. And by the start of the war, what I mean is the war in Europe. You've got scientists fleeing Europe, coming to the UK, saying that this U235, if you have a grapefruit size batch of this U235, the explosive strength of it could destroy a port, could easily destroy a small town, potentially could severely damage a city. And if you're at war, you're a politician, military leader, someone comes to the table with that kind of propositional theory that's obviously all written down. You're thinking, right, we need to have that. And then there's the added bad metaphor, but explosive fear. Have the Nazis got it? Because that's the driver here at the start. And you do see that in the film Oppenheimer in terms of it's key scientists that are then migrating from fleeing Europe to Britain, then from Britain to the United States. So before the United States is at war, Einstein's getting involved. Albert Einstein by then is working at Princeton, but he is the rock star of the physics world. He's probably past his best by then, but he's the guy that's got the pulling power to be listened to in the corridors of power at the White House, especially by President Roosevelt. So there's the famous, what we call Szilard letter, where it's drafted by a Hungarian physicist. He's the next generation below Albert Einstein, but he's a world leader in this theory. And they just put it in very layman's terms to Roosevelt. And this is 1939 going into 1940 about this concern. U-235 is this combustible material. If you have enough of it, it's a super weapon. It delivers the biggest explosion in history. And there is a potential that the Nazis are already ahead of the game of us.
How was the Manhattan Project set up? The two people are General Leslie Groves and then Robert Oppenheimer, who you've mentioned. And I have not seen Oppenheimer, but I've got to see it. It's on my short list. So how do they get involved with the Manhattan Project, or how do they create the Manhattan Project?
Well, that's what gets sign off. I mean, once this letter from Einstein and Szilard's been given to Roosevelt, the germ of the Manhattan Project begins in terms of there's a government committee. They set aside, when you think about the billions it would cost the Manhattan Project in the end, uh, I think it's $600,000 is set aside as a government budget. It's given some funding, and they're starting to get together some industrialists with the military to discuss how can we move forward with this. So it was getting there's a misconception that it's after Pearl Harbor in December 41 that this actually gets underway, but it hadn't been. It got the go ahead quite a few weeks before that happens. But as you know, war drives innovation and science and technology, and budgets increase, and that's where it happens, and that's where you then get it goes from a what you could argue is a civilian led project to a military led project. So the Manhattan Project is given handed over really to the Army Corps of Engineers. As soon as you do that, it's a military project, therefore it's top secret. But the Army Corps of Engineers has budgets in the billions, and they're really the only group that can do what needed to be done. And that's what I probably spend more time talking about the Manhattan Project when I'm giving talks, because it's just so fascinating when you think that this is a network, a web of, of factories, reactors, laboratories that stretches right across the United States, uh, constructing towns and cities for workers to work in them. There's over 130,000 workers will work on the Manhattan Project by war's end. I think nearly every state in the USA had something to do with the Manhattan Project in terms of either buildings or workforce. Academia gets involved. Chicago University, which is a real pioneer in the building of the world's first reactor, nuclear reactor. There's about 5,000 people work at Chicago University just on that. And we talk about, you talk about Groves and Oppenheimer. I don't know what your listeners in the USA think, but I genuinely mean this when I say it to British audiences here. There should be statues of General Groves in the United States. And I don't mean just about the Manhattan Project. You look at the work that man did up to the beginning of war after Pearl Harbor. He's one of the key leaders in the rebuilding of military infrastructure in the USA, whether that's building barracks, training grounds, depots, medical facilities, etc., etc. He's in charge of building the Pentagon, which at the time was the world's biggest building. He had a workforce of 10,000 people, brings it in on time and under budget.
Hmm.
Incredible. And so you can see why he's given the job. And, again, another spoiler alert. I liked Oppenheimer, the movie, but I don't think they did the work of Groves justice at all. I think Matt Damon captures him, definitely captures his dogmatic spirit. In Britain, we have a saying, a bulldog chewing a wasp. He's got that kind of, uh, doesn't suffer fools, huge, brilliant man manager, works all hours God sends, over everything when you think of what he was doing. But uh, he chooses Oppenheimer. And that's what, they do capture that in the movie. He knows, I think when I was interviewing one of his grandsons for the book, Grove's grandsons, that is, he said he thinks that his grandfather saw some of himself in Oppenheimer
Hmm.
in terms of potentially we are 18 months behind the Nazis, starting from scratch, a nuclear atomic program, weapons program. We've really got to go full bore for this. And I've got literally got to build the infrastructure across America in top secret, very, very quickly. I've got to assemble a team for the weapons lab, which would be in Los Alamos in the New Mexican desert. And I need the physicist, the scientist who's going to drive this on his side, the guy who's the key guy who's going to build this. And that's what his grandson said. He said he saw Oppenheimer, and even though there was security fears about him because he was left leaning, which the film obviously captures, uh, he knew that he was astute enough, driven enough, had the intelligence, had the respect for bringing the world's finest physicists, chemists, engineers to Los Alamos to work together for one goal, to beat the Germans to a nuclear weapon. So both those men are key. But Groves, I've got massive amount of respect for Groves.
I'm sorry to say he's all but forgotten in the United States. I guess until Matt Damon got to play him in the movie. Um,
Yeah,
there's another key character in your book, and that is Paul Tibbets Jr.
yeah.
Um, this is the person who, flies the bomber that drops the atomic bomb. What did he sign up for when when he joined the military in 1937, 8 years before he would have
Yeah.
to carry out that order?
Well, he's a guy that's born to fly. So I again, it's these key men that are in the book. I interviewed as much as I could. I interviewed family members because I can get all the information on them, the history. I wanted to know more about their character, and only the family can tell me that, and that's what I try and put in the book, and that's why it's different. But yeah, I mean, his family just said born flyer. I mean, his father ran. He's from Ohio, but the family moved to Miami, Florida, uh, in the late 20s, and they that's where they were based. His dad was a confectioner. I mean, you couldn't see it have different parents when you think about what he did. And his first flight in a plane was 12 years old. His dad wanted him to go up in a biplane in the passenger seat and throw sweets down on a festival outside of Miami to promote his confectionery business. And from there on, he had the bug. So yeah, you said he enlisted in 1937 before there's any war. His family wanted him to be a doctor. There was a big fight. There was a long running fight of his father. I sensed it's not about didn't forgive him, but resented the fact that he'd thrown it in his eyes, thrown it away to go and be a flyer. But once he was qualified as a pilot and commissioned into the U.S. Army Air Force in 1938, he sensed that yeah, you're on the right track. And the thing is, he got the gig for the Manhattan Project because of his wartime service up until then. And again, he's like Groves. He's like this driven guy, brilliant man manager, ruthless, doesn't suffer fools, but equally he's got an empathetic streak that he can bring the right people along with him to achieve the goal that he set. So he was in those first waves of bombers, B-17s, going over into occupied Europe in 1943 with the 8th Air Force, taking huge casualties, which you see in Masters of the Air, the TV series. He was in the first waves. He's one of the key commanders of that unit. Saw a hell of a lot of action.
It was his job, but did he have, you mentioned survivor's guilt. Did he have any guilt or any ill feelings towards what he ultimately had to carry out?
No, no, no. He was very, like part of the drive to be successful, but also patriotism. Big dollop of patriotism comes in there. He sees it. This is a war we didn't ask for. We were attacked. Germany's declared war on us. I'm at war. I'm going to do my job. That's the spirit he carried himself throughout the war. I would argue, and I do say that in the book, and it's just my opinion, but when you look at his war record and the amount of combat missions he did up until he left North Africa because he then flew missions in North Africa. I wouldn't be surprised if he had PTSD of some sort. Uh, and that's when that's when he's taken back to the USA because they built this revolutionary long range bomber, the B-29 Superfortress. Test flying isn't going well, and they think we need one of our best pilots to sort this out. And that's when he's recalled, and that's what he does for the next over a year. He's flying this new bomber, which has crashed quite a few times in tests. But his skill and expertise, but also what he was very good at, which is what I read in lots of archives, was the amount of technical detail he was able to give. Because you get a lot of flyers, they just love flying. They know the mechanics of flying, but they have no interest in avionics or anything like that. He was completely different. He did. And that I think that transferred over to the Manhattan Project eventually, where he'd be working with people like Oppenheimer and men within Oppenheimer's team talking about ballistics, the avionics of a refitted B-29 that would be able to carry the atomic bombs, how they would drop them, how they would get away. He knew all of that. So that's why he's gone in the book. That's why he's a key character in the book. I just, again, find him fascinating.
Yeah. I want to talk about you for a little bit here. You before we get back to the topic at hand. You've written books about Stalingrad and Berlin, as you mentioned. What led you to Japan? Was there something sort of neat and parallel about going sort of across
Yeah,
the continent there, and you say, well, now I've kind of landed in a logical place?
weird. It's a funny anecdote. Well, I find it funny anyway. Uh, I was doing my research for the Stalingrad book in Stalingrad, in Volgograd, and it was in lockdown. So I got special permission. This is before the Ukraine war, so traveling was far easier. But the guy who was in charge, they've got a very famous museum there. It's called the Panorama Museum, and it is full of thousands and thousands and thousands of written testimonies from Soviet soldiers who fought at Stalingrad. It's a treasure trove. And so their director of the museum, he's my age, and he's very into Western. Well, he's trying to get Western historians to visit. It was in lockdown, so it was impossible. So he managed to wangle it that I got over there. So I'm in this archive. Museum's pretty much shut. So I've got the run of the place, and it was a privilege and it was fantastic. So one day he said, "Well, you can look in everything else if you want to," and I did. So I had the free reign looking at the exhibits, going into they've got an armory, which is incredible. It's just full of German equipment that was captured after the battle. But there was one room that was about, I don't know, maybe 75 foot long by about 30 feet wide. It's a big room. And it seemed, first glance, full of trophies. And so I said to him, "What is this?" And he said, "Well, these are gifts we've had over the last 3 or 4 decades from cities that were destroyed themselves in the Second World War. And so that it's almost like a twinning effect. They want to show respect to Volgograd, Stalingrad by giving us something from their city." So famously, Britain gave them what's called the Sword of Stalingrad. So George V and Churchill made this huge medieval double-handed sword, which Churchill gave to Stalin at Yalta uh, to say, oh, it wasn't Yalta, sorry, I beg your pardon, it was Potsdam. Uh, and that's there. But on a table, and it was a huge, huge thing, it was a diorama, and it was the atomic dome from Hiroshima. And it was massive. It was like about 12 feet by 3 feet. And I was fascinated by it. And I said, "Well, what's this?" And he said, "Well, that's probably the pride of the collection because Hiroshima, the destruction on Hiroshima, is pretty much equivalent to what happened here." And it's true, it is. I mean, Stalingrad was completely destroyed, its population pretty much wiped out. And as a historian, it was more to do with that. I didn't see the commercial angle at all. I'm just thinking, wow, that could be a very interesting project to do because obviously, even when you're researching and writing a book, you obviously have your eye on what would be another project I could do. And I just found that, and then obviously got the Stalingrad book written, and then I spent about 6 months researching. Okay, what could I possibly do with Hiroshima? What would be interesting? And that's why you've got those four guys on the cover. It's only because the four men on the cover, John Hersey, General Groves, Robert Oppenheimer, and then the mayor of Hiroshima, I thought, I can find out brand new information on this and weave a story that incorporates the whole war.
Were you intimidated about taking on a topic that's been written about extensively? I mean, this is one of the topics that's been written about, as much as any other in world history.
Oh yeah, yeah, but I always you've got to be. It's not about being focused. I was going to say you've got to be deaf. You've just got to block out everything, even the inner fears. Say, "What are you doing?" Which happened many, many times. To say, "Well, what can I do?" I'll be honest. Uh, I feel more comfortable and more confident once I've done the research on the ground. So I'm a big believer in whatever subject you write about, you have to go there. You have to go there. And ideally, if you can, obviously, if it's the Second World War or beyond that, because obviously people die out, but you have to interview people. So once I'd done my 2 week trip to Japan, and then once I'd gone to America and I'd studied archives and met some people as well, I just thought, yeah, I've got enough first person, genuinely original material that I know I can write a book that people will find interesting and haven't read before.
What was your pitch to families of these folks? As you mentioned, a lot of the stuff is in the archives, but to get the real color, you've got to go to the families. How did you approach them? What were the things that you said to either make them open up or say, yeah, this is a story worth telling again about my loved one?
It's about character. So I said to them, like Tibbets, for instance, I said, obviously the world knows what he did. And you can find his service record online. You can go in the archives and read it. The man's even published his memoir, I think in the 1980s, which I've got, is very good. But nothing beats the personal recollections of people that were intimately close to him. Because even if it's I mean, it's true. Even if it's a couple of expanded paragraphs in a book of 120,000 words, it's worth it because you're giving people fresh insight into someone they might have known. So, for instance, with Tibbets, your listeners could go on YouTube or they could Google his name. They will find dozens of interviews he gave over the years, and that's one of the reasons why I admire him. Which I should remember to say is I admire the man's message discipline because if you imagine he's in his late 20s when he drops that bomb and he lived till he was 91
Yeah, it's been 80
and
years,
but
right? Yeah, telling people
he's got
about this
he's
moment. Yeah,
exactly well and I was going to say 80 years of justifying it
right,
and
right.
that's what I mean by message discipline. He never once kind of you would think break and say, well, I do regret it, I did this. He was very much we were at war, there's no morality in war. I was following orders. I know that that's a bad term, but it's what he was doing. But that's the key thing. You can find all that. But what you won't find is his grandson, Paul Tibbets IV, who listened to him growing up and was inspired by him and ended up joining the US Air Force himself and would actually fly the first combat mission of the B-2 stealth bomber in the late 1990s and became a brigadier general just like his grandfather. He just gave me insight into the personal life of the man, but also what must have he been thinking when he's flying his country's most advanced strategic long range bomber? Because Paul Tibbets IV he's flying the B-2. So he's giving me this insight in both directions, which is invaluable. To a historian, it's invaluable because it's fresh, it's new.
And to a reader, how valuable. As FDR, back to the sort of story here, as FDR dies in April of 1945, just explain where things stand with the Manhattan Project, but also, and this is one of the things that another author we've had on our show has said, and that is that it was inexcusable that Harry Truman didn't know about all this stuff until the moment he's literally in office and taking on the weight of not just the presidency, but of this enormous war.
Well, if you're I mean, I'm a fan of FDR to a degree, New Deal, all that kind of thing. But you could argue it's a dereliction of duty almost in terms of Truman comes into the job unexpectedly because the commander in chief just passed away suddenly from a stroke. So much catch up to do, and again, that's what I say in talks is I've got huge admiration for Truman in terms of the workload he took on. Uh, yes, he's got to handle the Manhattan Project, which he discovers for the first time, which I couldn't find anything, but I questioned that at first because I was thinking he was heavily involved in the oversight committee for defense spending. Surely he must have seen there must have been some payments go across his desk because by the end of the war, the Manhattan Project's well over 3 billion budget. He must have anyway. Uh, but he's got that. But the war's going to be finished in Europe within a month or so, I suppose. He's got to go to Europe to make the peace. He's got to go and sit down with men he's only seen from afar because Roosevelt handled it all. Churchill and Stalin. He's got 3 million men of the Red Army parked in Central Europe. That's a concern. He's being told that the country wants the armed forces to now come back from Europe and come home. And then he's looking at the Pacific, and that's why I admire him. He's got all this going on two fronts, and I think the Manhattan Project, yes, it's a surprise, but again, you've got to remember that this Truman is a man who knew the value of explosives. I mean, he'd served fighting on the Great War as an artillery officer. So if he has Henry Stimson, his Secretary of War, come in with the top secret file on his first day in the Oval Office and say, well, we've been developing this top secret project for the last 3 years, and one bomb, one shell's got the equivalent they didn't know exactly, but he's saying of 15,000, 20,000 tons of TNT. Politics comes into play too, doesn't it? It's military strategist plus politics. You think this could be my ace in the hole, as in I'm facing this implacable enemy in the Pacific. We've practically almost overrun the Nazis. Job done. It's come at a huge cost in civilian and military deaths in that last year that I was talking about, but it's still going on in the Pacific. And you look at MacArthur's campaign in the Philippines, which was just medieval barbarity, the defense the Japanese put up. I mean, 100,000 civilians died with the Japanese defense of Manila, just one city, 100,000 people. And you're looking at all the deaths of the US military as they're doing the island topping campaign. And you mentioned Okinawa. They looked 60,000 casualties, dozens of ships in the US Pacific Fleet damaged or sunk. And that's just to capture an island 60 miles long and about 5 miles wide. So I completely admire him thinking, wow, imagine coming up to speed with all of that and trying to get the best deals possible at Potsdam, being in charge of the world's democratic response to Japan about unconditional surrender, and then having trying to think of the right word, I suppose, ruthless pragmatism to drive that through and say, okay, if you're not going to play ball and surrender when you clearly have to, we're going to continue with the incendiary raids, which did more damage, to be fair, killed more people, dehoused 8.5 million Japanese. But we now will use the atomic bomb. And then remember, he comes into power in April. They still didn't know the plutonium bomb would work. That's why you've got the Trinity test in July. There was still a race to get that finished. They knew the uranium bomb would work, but they only had one of those. They might have had two by the end of the war. But it was the plutonium bomb that Groves said, because they built the reactor that's producing enriched plutonium. I think we're jumping ahead slightly, but once that first plutonium bomb worked on Nagasaki, Groves had already told Truman, we'll have 100 of these ready to roll by October 1945 if they still haven't surrendered. So, yeah.
When it comes to the decision itself, what was the key thing that the president says, we've got to do this? And once the bomb hits, how did he take the results of it?
Well, there is a swathe of people underneath the office of the president that are doing all the work, that are giving him all the information he needs, whether it's civilian, government, the military, or the scientists that Groves is in charge of. They've all got a say that's going up to the president's office. But generally, the feeling is, because of Okinawa and because of the fight, because of the real, again, I'd say it's suicidal discipline of the Japanese on the home islands to say, well, we are ready and waiting for you. We've inculcated and disciplined our nation, 73 million Japanese. There's more than that by now. They had a slogan of suicide of a nation. I mean, they were prepping the civilian population for a fight to the finish if the Americans had launched their amphibious landing on the home islands. So that's the weight of decision making. Is you give the green light to the US militaries to start planning Operation Olympic, which will be the invasion of Japan, which he's being told by the strategists, could take 1 million casualties by the end of the year, and it still won't be over. Or, as I said, you've got your ace in the hole of the Manhattan Project by the time of July, where Okinawa's still, the fighting's still going on, but it's at least 2/3 of the way through. That's where Tibbets' unit, top secret unit, the 509th Composite Group, that's been training to drop an atomic bomb with their super improved B-29s. They're on Tinian Island on the Marianas Islands. That's where General Curtis LeMay of the 20th Bomber Command's been launching his incendiary raids over Japan. They're on a top secret part of that base, waiting for the green light. So I suppose that it's the pragmatist again in Truman, as in, we have to give the Japanese a message that we're serious. We've already given the Potsdam Declaration to them of unconditional surrender. They haven't even acknowledged it. They haven't. There's no word coming back. So we have to do it. and that's why he gives the order. And you've heard this before. You must have heard this when you've been taught as a high school student at university that it saves lives. So that's what he's looking at. He's top of the tree as a politician. He's not stupid. He's thinking, I'm in power. I want re-election. I'm getting hundreds of letters every day, thousands every week from parents wondering and wives wondering when their husbands and children are going to come back from the Pacific, back to the States. I'm getting several thousand US casualties every week. This has to stop. And I'm being told I'll save more lives if I drop this atomic bomb because it might force them to surrender.
The mayor of Hiroshima, Senkichi Awaya, is one of the key people in your book. Why did you find his story so important, despite the fact that he's killed in the bombing, and we really have no way of knowing what he experienced that day?
Sure. Because because my book I want readers to know it's not just a book specifically about the Second World War. I mean, there's a huge part of it is, but I'm trying to show the reader it's almost a 25-year journey from the mid 1920s through to the end of the war and beyond the end of the war, why we got to where we are with nuclear technology, nuclear fallout, why it was used, the barbarity of the fighting in the Pacific, and crucially, and this is where Senkichi Awaya comes in, why Japan mirrors Nazi Germany in terms of it was a democratic state in the 1920s, but it then falls into far right nationalism, which then morphs into military totalitarianism. And that's what leads them into this catastrophic war on the Chinese mainland and then against the Americans in the Pacific. And Senkichi Awaya mirrors that. His life and career because he was a civilian administrator. He starts his career in the mid 1920s, and it ends with the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima. He dies instantly because his mayor's residence is. I went there. It's probably about 400 meters away from Ground Zero, so instantly killed. And again, shows you what good research does. I genuinely did think I won't find any information on him. I'll try and find bits and pieces on him, and that'll be it. But when I went on my research trip to Japan, I found out that he had several children and 3 survived the war. His wife died of radiation poisoning. He died in the initial explosion. The house fell on her, and that's how she survived. But she died 2 weeks later from radiation poisoning. But anyway, the 3 eldest children decided in the 1960s we want to remember our father, so we're going to write his personal memoir of him, of his life and career. And there's one copy in the Japanese National Library in Tokyo, and I found it, and it was placed there in 1965. And so it's not a big book; it's only probably about 40,000 words, but it tells that story that I've just outlined. It shows you his early life, his career, and that's the ironic thing. He was the first generation of his family that could afford to go to university. Why? Because his father embraced Western culture that came into Japan before and after the Great War. His father worked for American railroad firms, building railroads throughout Japan, crisscrossing the home islands. That's how the family got their wealth. That's how they could afford to send him to university. That's how his career blossomed. So there's that.
When the bombs are dropped, or at least the first one, Japan still hadn't had enough. Uh, what was it about the second one where they just said, "We've got it. This is over. We've got to just give up"?
Because you've got to remember the country was 2 reasons. The country's on its knees already before the atomic bombs were dropped. The incendiary raids had destroyed, I think, burnt 40% of urban Japan right across the country. 66 cities dropped with incendiaries. The country's starving because America, the B-29 bombing force led by Curtis LeMay, also operated Operation Starvation. So they're bombing the rice fields, but also the American submarine arm. They pretty much sank the mercantile shipping arm of Japan. There's no supplies getting into the country. But it would have taken 5 or 6 more months for societal collapse, as we would know it, before you could think it's safe to step foot on mainland Japan and invade without them putting up much of a fight. But Nagasaki is the key, I suppose, in terms of It comes 3 days after Hiroshima. And you've got to remember the Japanese don't know the Americans only had two bombs on Tinian at that time. So Nagasaki's bombed. The Americans know, Tibbets knows on Tinian, we do have another bomb that we can get ready that will be ready to drop on the 19th of August. So that's, well over a week after Nagasaki's been bombed. Uh, and Groves has told Truman, plutonium's going to be online very soon. We'll have 100 plutonium bombs ready by October. Japanese leadership don't know that. All they know is systematically their cities are being wiped from the face of the earth in one bomb, and they're powerless to do anything about it because their air defense systems aren't good enough. The B-29 can fly at an altitude that can't really be touched, so they're at the mercy of where next. You do have hardliners holding out, as you saw with Nazi Germany in Berlin. You've got the hardliners in Hitler's bunker right to the very end that are all going to commit suicide. They are around the emperor, but common sense prevails. And even though they still don't know whether the position of the emperor can be maintained once they've surrendered, they're hoping that that might be the case. And that's where the emperor is forced for the very first time to publicly address his people, which is what I capture in the book. When I interviewed some of the elderly Japanese, they said weirdly, you would think it's weird. They said it was the greatest day of their lives because of the first time they heard their emperor's voice. That's the divine position of the emperor in that country at that moment. And for a great many of Japanese, they had no idea the war was going that bad for the country. Mm. So you've got this sense of bewilderment, wonder because they're hearing the emperor, but shame. The dominant feeling was shame because, again, they'd surrendered without their enemy stepping 1 foot on mainland sovereign soil of Japan, yet they'd surrendered. And that's what drove it too. But Nagasaki was definitely the straw that broke the camel's back, shall we say.
We've only got a few minutes left. I have a couple more I want to get to. It's pretty crazy. You look at pictures of Hiroshima today. There are some modern buildings there. There are many modern buildings there. You can see some of the sort of buildings that look like they were destroyed or at least heavily damaged in the war. They're still up. They pay an enormous legacy to this all as a lesson of what can happen. Just walking through that city of today, how did those lessons hit you?
It really hits you when you're obviously by the river. So Hiroshima's on a plain. It's surrounded by in a horseshoe formation by a beautiful mountain range, but it's on a plain, which you could argue is going into a floodplain, and the city's separated by several tributaries which flow into a main river, which then flows into the bay, Hiroshima Bay. There are a few of the old style houses and buildings that they've rebuilt in that style because, again, a 1.5 mile radius of ground zero, completely flattened, completely destroyed. They've rebuilt a tiny amount of it, but it's very much a modern city. But what I wanted to do, because I pinpointed at least a dozen eyewitnesses who survived, I went to all 4 points of the compass of where they lived in the city, just to get a perspective, a geographical perspective of how far they were away, what they would have seen, etc., etc. But it is really only when you go down to the center of the city where ground zero is, and you see the atomic dome, the destroyed atomic dome, that it really kind of hits home. I mean, it can never replicate the destruction that you would have seen on the day itself. What I would argue that the biggest feeling and emotion you get is when you go into the Hiroshima Memorial Museum. Again, listeners, if they haven't been and they're planning on going to Hiroshima or Japan itself, it has to be number one on your list to do. You can't come out of there without having tears in your eyes. I mean, they've done their job very, very well in terms of eyewitness testimony, artifacts, photographs, sketches, child sketches always tell the most emotive stories. So there's lots of that. And it's just done in a very, very respectful, again, I'm using the same word, but emotive way. And that in itself packs, in my opinion anyway, packs more of a punch than walking around that part of the city because it's predominantly been rebuilt in a modern way.
This is the $1 trillion question. What if the Nazis had gotten the bomb? Can we even imagine what would have happened?
I wouldn't be here speaking to you.
Yeah.
They would have dropped. Yeah, I mean, they would have instantly dropped it on Moscow. They would have dropped it on London, all the key places. It's a good counterfactual argument. I've done it before, but
I mean, we'd all be
I
living under the Third Reich potentially.
yeah. He wouldn't have
Not an
thought twice.
exaggeration. Yeah.
Not an exaggeration. And I was going to say though, to be honest, uh, Paul Tibbets of the Enola Gay, he had discussed with some of his closest friends that were with him in the 509. So Van Kirk and Ferriby, his bombardier and navigator, they'd served with each other all through the fighting in Europe. So he specifically chose them to come with him to this new top secret unit, and they were in the Enola Gay with him. They were called the Three Musketeers. But he confided to them, saying, well, we could be dropping this on Germany. You just never know. So the Americans would have, they would have dropped it on Germany if the Nazis had carried on fighting.
Do you think the way this has been memorialized has been a factor in why this has not happened again, why there has not been a nuclear bomb dropped again?
Uh, to
Just
a
in other words, the
degree,
way it was remembered, the way the warnings that
yeah.
have been issued, the understanding of the power. Do you think that sort of, you know, memorialization of it has led to a certain conscience in the leaders of countries that have these weapons?
I think it did to a degree in the early years after the Second World War, but it's when you go from an atomic bomb that can destroy half a city or a city to the 1950s, where you've then got the development of a hydrogen bomb, at least 1,000 more times powerful. That's when you get into genocide. You're going to destroy, three or four of them, you destroy the whole country. Uh, and you get the era of MAD, mutually assured destruction. I think that's more important. I think that's what drives people today.
The visit that President Obama made to pay respects to those killed by the bombings, how meaningful was that in Japan?
Very, very. They weren't. I mean, I'm only saying I can only describe what Japanese I interviewed at the time said to me. They didn't see it as him apologizing. They just said it's more of an acknowledgement that they recognize the suffering. It's not about saying we apologize for doing this. It's in terms of it's war. We dropped it. We recognize that it killed a lot of people, and that makes us sad. And it's official recognition. So it did mean a lot to a lot of Japanese, especially dignitaries and politicians in Hiroshima and Tokyo, the ones I talked to anyway. So Kenji Shiga that you mentioned at the start, he was director of the museum, and he was one of the team that led Obama around the main monuments there. So it meant a lot to him when I interviewed him.
Who are Duncan, Lena, Miles, and Manuela? Why did you dedicate the book to them?
Well, I always dedicate it to family. So Duncan and Lena are my dad's brother and sister who have since passed away, and I wanted to honor them. And then Miles and Manuela it's the it just shows you how curious things now happen on the internet. Who would have thought? I discovered I had a half brother on Facebook about 7 years ago, and he lives in Australia. That's Miles, and his wife Manuela, and we're brothers. So I wanted to
Wow.
dedicate the book to him.
You
So
never, I never know what I'm going to get when I ask the question about the
there you
dedication,
go.
and that's a new one. Have you decided what you're going to do next yet, if anything?
Yes, I am. Again, it's a human story. It's always about the human story. I am looking at the Great Depression.
Hmm. All right.
So yeah, because
Fascinating.
it's again, it doesn't have to be military. It's all for me. It's about the human experience.
You love writing about happy topics.
That's what my wife says.
That's right. There you go. Iain MacGregor, the author of The Hiroshima Men, The Quest to Build the Atomic Bomb and the Fateful Decision to Use It. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Check out the book, also his website, iainmcgregor.com. He's on Twitter at Iain_MacGregor1. Axelbankhistory.com was designed by Nikki Rideout of Ellie Claire Designs. Check her work out. The website has our most recent episodes on it, also featured episodes, and a link to our Patreon page. Certainly go there, patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.